Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, Sarah, to be with you today. Facts about food to help farmers fight back, because boy, do you guys need to have something to help you fight back at the moment. We've got vegans daubing butchers' shops in affluent areas. We've got death threats being administered to you lovely people without whom we would not be eating. So this has got to stop, and I hope that some of these facts will help you do exactly that. So we're in 3 parts. First one is some facts about food, and when I present this at medical conferences, most doctors and medics don't know these basic facts about food. We're then going to go on to defend red meat quite carefully. There's going to be a bit on cholesterol, because I know it comes up and many people in the audience may be interested. And then we're going to close with how to win an argument with a vegetarian. Declaration of interest, I used to be a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian for 20 years, so I can talk from both sides of the fence. Now, any references, I do academic research. I am a PhD. If any of you want to make a note of any of the references down in the bottom left-hand corner, just go to my site, put in /groundswell, and you'll see the references for about a dozen slides, I think, have got academic references on them. Facts about food. In all this stuff that's going on at the moment, and the Daily Mail, Good Health, and other newspapers talking about food on a regular basis, we seem to have forgotten why we eat. And we eat because, quite simply, we die without certain things. Now, in the field of nutrition, essential means what the normal word means, but it also means something else. It means something that you have to consume. You cannot make it within the body. So, for example, cholesterol is essential in that you die without it, but it's not essential in that you have to eat it in food. The body will make it. Cholesterol is so essential, you don't even rely on the fact that you could get it from food. But the things that you are required to get from food in the macronutrient arena, and macronutrients are what we know as carbohydrates, protein, and fat. They are big nutrients, macronutrients. We have essential amino acids within the protein category, and we have essential fatty acids within the fat category. It may interest you to know that there is no essential carbohydrate, and that is not a controversial statement. You will have agreement on that from the other side, the ones who want us to be eating the majority of our diet in the form of carbohydrate. They will admit that it is completely non-essential. Now we come to micronutrients, smaller nutrients, things that we need in smaller quantities. We have 13 vitamins, 8 B vitamins that are water-soluble, and the vitamin C is also water-soluble. And then we have the 4 fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. This was the first thing that led me down the path of moving away from being a vegetarian. Because when I started attending nutrition conferences back in 2009, I realized for the first time that the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K, come in an animal form and a plant form. And guess which form the body wants? So vitamin A, for example, retinol, the form that comes from animal is the form that the body needs. Carotene comes from plants. Not everybody can convert carotene to retinol, and some people do it particularly poorly. Vitamin D3 is the one that comes from animals, D2 from plants, K2 from animals, K1 from plants, and we need the animal form. Now, on the other side of micronutrients, we have minerals, and there's a little bit more debate as to how many minerals the human body needs, but we could probably agree on somewhere between about 15 and 20, and certainly these 15 will be well known to you, things like calcium, zinc, sodium. Of course, sodium, which we demonize as well, is an absolutely essential nutrient without which we would die fairly quickly. Now, over the years, I've developed this slide to explain to people what food actually is in terms of those macronutrients. And this is the slide that not many people seem to be aware of. So my laser pointer isn't working, but if I use the mouse here, there is only one 100% carbohydrate on the planet, and that is sucrose. Even honey has some water content. It's about 87% carbohydrate. Honey and sugar have no protein and no fat, so they have nothing useful in terms of macronutrients. Sucrose also has nothing useful in terms of micronutrients, no vitamins, no minerals. Arguably, it should not qualify as a food because it is bringing nothing that we need as human beings. That's your only 100% carbohydrate. At the other end of the spectrum, I put it to you that 100% fats are also not that natural as foods. Should we be eating olives, for example, or should we be extracting masses of fat from a lot of olives and consuming in that form? Ditto with sunflower seeds, ditto with coconut oil. Now, there is no food on the planet that is 100% protein. The closest that you'll get to 100% protein is egg whites, white fish, or skinless chicken breasts. Again, not what I would call natural foods. You should be eating the whole chicken piece with the skin on, and the whole egg, of course, with the ultra-nutritious yolk. But the protein in the yellow across the top is showing you that protein is in absolutely everything other than those extremes of sucrose and fat. So protein is in lettuce, it's in apples, it's in anything that's going to come out of the plants or gardens. Now, what really interests me trying to look at food and helping people to lose weight is that nature tends to put foods in two different groups. Nature tends to put foods either as a carbohydrate protein, which would be things that vegans would eat and vegetarians would eat, things that come from trees, things that come from the ground, and those are represented in green because they've got the mixture of the blue carbohydrate and the yellow protein. And then on this side of the fence, you've got the yellow and red combo in orange, and those are things that vegans don't eat. Of course, vegetarians would eat dairy and eggs, and those are the fat proteins. Now, it's really rare that nature puts carbohydrate, fat, and protein in good measure in the same foods. And the exceptions are things like nuts and seeds, and for that purpose I would call avocado a nut rather than a fruit. And that's the domain of the fake food industry. That's what they have worked out is irresistible and Moorish to human beings. Because once we start eating that fat-carb combo, we don't seem to be able to stop. Now, the complete protein, if you remember back to that first slide, where we've got the essential amino acids, those are provided only by the foods of animal origin. You can get complete protein by eating vegetarian food, but you've got to know your food very well, mix it very carefully. And again, you've got the essential fatty acids, the provision of which is dominated by the animal side of that coloured chart. It may interest you to know that you do actually find fat in some of these foods in trace amounts, just as you find carbohydrate in some of these foods in trace amounts. So as I got closer to the brown in the middle, you're getting closer to having a little bit of the food on the other side. So when you put those three macronutrients into a pie chart, because that is all that we eat, the interesting outcome of protein being in everything is that protein tends to form a pretty constant 15% of any natural diet. There's a couple of refs down the bottom there if you want to understand why that is, but trust me, in any natural diet, vegetarian or animal eating, protein tends to be a pretty constant 15%. Now, you might think, therefore, that a balanced diet might be 42% fat and 42% carb. That's not actually the case, because in 1977 in the US and in 1983 in the UK, the governments, in their infinite wisdom, decided to demonize fat, total fat and saturated fat. And my PhD was actually an examination of the evidence base for the introduction of those two dietary fat guidelines. So I probably know the evidence for that introduction probably better than anyone else in the world. And the two guidelines were no more than 30% of the diet should come in the form of total fat, no more than 10% of the diet should come in the form of saturated fat. And I was expecting there to be some evidence. I was quite surprised to find that there was absolutely no evidence at the time those guidelines were introduced. And there is no more evidence if you look at the totality of the evidence available today in 2018. So I'm in constant battles with Public Health England and government bodies, and so are colleagues in the US, trying to get those sorted out. Just in case, I mean, you can see that the consequences, if protein is a fixed 15%, and then you put in a 30% fat guideline, carbohydrate necessarily has to take up the remainder. And in case people didn't work that out, the American mandated it here, increase your carbohydrate consumption to 55 or 60% of your total food intake. And that's the one macronutrient that we don't need. That was unprecedented. Now, this is why Again, if somebody goes low carb, and some of you may be hearing about paleo movements or Banting movements or low carb or even low carb high fat or the real food movement, when people choose to have a very small proportion of their diet in the form of carbohydrate, you can see that because there's only 3 things that we eat, fat has to take up the slack. And these guys are your friends, and they might be your only area of growth coming forward. I certainly think they are your most significant area of growth. And just as the government might be driving you to take saturated fat out of your animals and your livestock, which is completely insane and completely unnatural, rest assured there is a growing movement of people who want your stuff. They are prepared to pay for it. They are not wasting money on Coca-Cola and junk food and brands, and they want to get to know their butcher and to know where their meat and their eggs and their dairy have come from. In defence of red meat, I think this section is pretty much why I got invited along to this, because somebody subscribes to my site. I issue a newsletter every Monday morning, and a little while ago the International Association for Research into Cancer had their latest pop at red meat, and somebody got in touch and very kindly asked if they could share my newsletter with a number of people from the Pasture Fed Livestock Association. I was thrilled for that to happen, and this invite came as a result. So isn't it nice when things like that work out? And this is the essence of a presentation that I gave for the Sustainable Food Trust in November 2016 in defence of red meat. Now, there's a common sense argument. This is what has happened to mankind over the last 3.5 million years. And essentially, we've gone from a diet philosophy of if you can catch it, eat it, if you can forage it, eat it, to base your meals on starchy foods. Which clearly doesn't make sense. And we're going to end this presentation on the common sense argument as well. So we then look at the evidence argument, and this is what I do for a living as a completely independent researcher. I'm not paid by any organisation, certainly not by meat or dairy or eggs. I say what I think about those products because of what I know about their nutrition. So in evidence, we have a number of different levels of evidence. I'm really sorry that this is playing up. I hope it's not upsetting people's eyes. But as you move up the pyramid, really it's only when you get to this top part of the pyramid that things start becoming serious evidence that you can consider. There's very little in the way of case control studies in this field. Population studies are when you take a population and you measure as much about that population as you can at the beginning and then follow them over time to see who develops cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and so on. And then you can look at the original data and say, do you know what? The people who smoked tended to go on to develop lung cancer. And that's exactly how we started identifying those associations, but they're only associations. To get into A causes B, red meat causes cancer, you've got to get into things like randomized control trials, which is this red bit up here. And then where I did my PhD was in what we call systematic reviews and meta-analyses of dietary trials. So you pull them all together and you get a much more powerful outcome as a result. So here are all the meta-analyses of evidence against red meat. Camilla's going to try and help me if we can stop this flickering. And I haven't forgotten to put anything on that slide because that is all the meta-analysis evidence against red meat. That is all the RCT evidence against red meat. Randomized controlled trial interventions where one group were fed red meat and one group weren't fed red meat and different things were measured. And that is it. Again, there is no RCT evidence against red meat. So when I was doing this presentation for the Sustainable Food Trust, I remember my expertise was in dietary fat, so I hadn't gone specifically into red meat. I went to the most recent dietary guideline evidence in the world, and it happened to be the American evidence, because their dietary guidelines for Americans were reissued in 2015. And they didn't particularly look at red meat, they looked at animal protein. And they have a whole library, which you can see there on reference 3. They have a nutrition library with all the evidence that they want to put across against animal protein. So I sat down with a few weeks before this presentation and went through every single piece of evidence. And I've summarized it here for you on this one slide. If you've taken photos, this is the one that you want to catch. So on cardiovascular disease, there were 7 studies, 4 only looked at egg, 1 was looking at low carbohydrate diets rather than any particular product. Not one actually evaluated red meat, let alone found against it. And remember, heart disease is the one that they really try to hammer red meat for. Blood pressure, there were 6 studies. Overall, they found no association whatsoever, not even a relationship. You have to start with a relationship before you can then test if it's causal. No relationship. Type 2 diabetes, 7 studies, not one evaluated red meat, let alone found against it. Body weight, no association from 3 studies. This is the one that surprised me, because I had heard that red meat is implicated in colorectal cancer, which is the combined bowel cancer and rectal cancer. There were 13 studies, and the conclusion from the American authorities, no consistent findings on the type of meat or meat product and colorectal cancer. This was November 2016. Prostate cancer, 2 didn't examine red meat, the other 4 found no association. Breast cancer, 6 studies, no association. That was the entire pool of evidence. I left nothing out. It was not in my interest to be biased or to find in favour of red meat. So then came the IARC report in April, and they announced that it's probably carcinogenic, which puts in a caveat immediately, mainly for colorectal cancer. We've got another caveat straight away. So I went to their 571-page document, whatever it was, and I honed in on the bit that they said provided the evidence for this claim. And it turned out to be 14 cohort studies. Those are those population studies when you follow people for a long time, and 2 cohort consortia, which turned out to be completely irrelevant genetic studies, so we could dismiss those straight away. And those were the ones that they said provided the information on the association that they were claiming between red meat and colorectal cancer. So what I would normally do is go into those papers and look at the flaws in those papers. But I thought, let's not plough into that straight away. Let's just take their evidence on face value. Even when I know some of those studies have included processed meat in their definition of red meat, which virtually every study does, I'm not going to get into that just yet. I'm just going to see what those 14 studies say. I was astonished. 13 out of 14 in their own literature, and all of this is extracted in reference 4, and you can see the exact quotations from the literature in that reference. All of these studies found no association, let alone causation, between red meat, whatever their definition was, and colorectal cancer. There was one study alone that found an association, and that was the Seventh-day Adventist study. Now, for any of you who know the Seventh-day Adventists, loads of studies come out from the Seventh-day Adventists. They reside over in a beautiful part of California. They have very strange religious beliefs. They're vegetarian, non-drinking, non-smoking, and there's lots of other things that they don't do. So when you're studying Seventh-day Adventists and you're studying people within that population who actually do eat meat, they are already breaking all the codes of the church. So I did wonder if guilt could therefore possibly be associated with colorectal cancer, because if these guys were eating meat, they sure as hell shouldn't have been. And their definition of meat, interestingly, included fish, which is generally held by almost everybody to be good for us. But no, it wasn't in the Seventh-day Adventist study. Even the IARC cautioned about putting any emphasis on this one study, and yet it was the only one of their studies that showed anything. Now, before we move on from processed meat, because while I am a fan of real food and I am pretty against processed food, it has to be said that when it comes to meat, there are massive degrees of difference in processed meat. And I am a big fan of what we would call naturally cured meat, naturally preserved meat, the stuff that gets dried, salted naturally that you'll find in delicatessens and good butchers. That is a world away from the spam that has got wheat and sugar and other junk in it that might be sold in package in supermarkets. So don't be put off entirely by processed meat either. So we're now going to move on to the nutrition arguments. We've been looking a bit there at evidence, and there's some really, really daft things said of red meat. One of the daftest things that's said of red meat is that it will clog your arteries. Now, there is actually only one way in which red meat can clog your arteries, and that is if you intravenously inject it. Otherwise, we have a digestive system. And if you put steak into your mouth, it goes down through your esophagus, into your stomach. The protein is extracted and digested, it then goes into your lower intestines where the fat is extracted, and then the lymphatic system will take all the nutrients and transport them off around the body. It does not go in any form into your bloodstream. The second really daft thing that people say about red meat is that it's full of saturated fat. So let's see what steak is really full of. 71% water, and you've got to start with a non-cooked steak because it's the only fair way to compare food, always the raw weight. If you cook it, the only thing that this steak is going to lose is that water. It's not going to gain anything or lose anything other than water. So 71% water, 21% protein. You've got the reference on that first slide for where exactly I get this information on food. You've got ash and minerals, as in most food, and then you've got 7% of that steak, approximately, is fat. And of that fat, 2 of those 7 percentage points of fat are saturated fat. Saturated fat is literally the last thing that a steak is when you look at water, protein, fat, and unsaturated fat. Not that saturated fat is bad for you, but just to put the record straight. So when you know that, and we start to have a little bit of fun, any idea, if the slide stays still long enough, which of these foods has more saturated than unsaturated fat? We've got a steak, we've got eggs, we've got mackerel, we've got lard, we've got almonds, we've got olive oil, and we've got low-fat milk. Anyone like to hazard a guess on which has got more saturated than unsaturated fat? I haven't heard the one shouted out yet. It's the low-fat milk. That is the only food on that slide that has more saturated than unsaturated fat. Again, not that one is better or worse than the other. This slide, and for those of you sat at the front, you should have a postcard on your chair. If you're at the back and you don't have a postcard, do come and nick one, because this is such a great little postcard to put in your handbag or your wallet or pocket or whatever for when people talk to you nonsense about red meat and saturated fat. Because what this shows you is the total fat in the left-hand number. So if we look at and I know that's not a sirloin, but they call them different things in the US. So the total fat in that steak is 7 grams per 100 grams. The saturated fat is 2.1. And then over in the low-fat milk here, the total fat is only 1%, but of that, the majority is saturated fat. So the two things that you need to know about fat, which are not widely enough known. Number one, every single food that contains fat contains all 3 fats, saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. There are no exceptions. And the second thing you need to know about fat is the only food group that has more saturated than unsaturated fat is dairy products. Not that that's a bad thing, but just to set the record straight. So eggs have got more unsaturated fat. You can see there it's a ratio of about 7:3. Lard has got more saturated fat. I particularly love that one because a lot of people just don't get that. And then you start to have some fun with our dietary guidelines, because you can see that this oily fish that we're told to eat has twice the total fat and 1.5 times the saturated fat of the red meat that we're told to avoid. Olive oil, as some of you shouted out, olive oil has 7 times the saturated fat of steak. Now, we wouldn't eat 100 grams of olive oil, people say, yes, but a tablespoon of olive oil has more saturated fat than a 100-gram pork chop. So dietary guidelines are nonsense when you know something about food. And those are particular ones to single out on your little postcard, as I have done to wind up people who think fat is bad for us. Now, on the other side of your little postcard, we've got some of those micronutrients, because the other thing that people forget when they tell us to avoid red meat and eggs and butter and dairy because they're so fearful of fat content is that this is where nature also puts all the micronutrients that we need for optimal health. So reference 7 will give you links to all of those products, so you can go and see those for yourself. You've got a table here with liver, this one's chicken liver, sirloin steak, eggs, apples for those who think 5 a day is a valuable message, and brown rice for those who think healthy whole grains is a powerful message, because you'll see that they're not. So I've put in here, and you can see in red at a glance, the winner in each row. So brown rice wins on calories, probably not the one you want to win on. Liver wins on protein quality. Liver smashes everything on retinol. Then you've got the B vitamins, for of course, liver is also fantastic for those. Iron, liver is fantastic. Steak, red meat is just a really good all-rounder, and it's absolutely awesome for zinc. Now, not many people know this, but liver even beats apples for vitamin C. Liver has 4 times the vitamin C of an apple. Not many people know that. So why on earth would you have a public health message to eat 5 a day? And if I put kale or broccoli up here, yes, they would beat liver finally for vitamin C, but they wouldn't beat any of the other products for anything else. Why would you be telling people to eat fruit and veg and whole grains and to steer them away from meat and eggs and dairy if you were trying to get people to get their daily nutrient intake? Now, just while we're on saturated fat, the reference there is from some European data. The data goes back about 10 years because, very interestingly, the data stopped putting on saturated fat intake in the same report that measured coronary heart disease deaths across Europe, because a number of researchers did exactly what I did here, which is to take each of the 44 countries in Europe and to plot them on a diagram and to say what was the saturated fat intake relative to the coronary heart disease. Now, if you're good at graphs, you can see already that the higher the saturated fat intake, the lower the death rate. The lower the saturated fat intake, the higher the death rate. There is a strong inverse relationship between saturated fat intake and coronary heart disease across Europe. That's for men. It's even stronger for women. And this is when we have the brief little sojourn into cholesterol, because cholesterol is always a good, fun one to go into. I'm the only researcher who has done this one. This is plotting the cardiovascular disease death rates. That's now taken into account heart disease and strokes. That's what cardiovascular disease is. And I've plotted average cholesterol levels for all 192 countries in the world from World Health Organization data. And you can see that, again, it's a slight downwards trend. So this is for men. The higher your cholesterol, the lower the death rate from cardiovascular disease. This is for women, and you'll start to see that trend line now go a little bit steeper. The higher your cholesterol, the lower your death rate from cardiovascular disease. You do it for all deaths, and it starts getting steeper still for males. Whatever the cause of death, the higher your cholesterol, the lower your death rate. And for women, it is seriously strong. Any statisticians in the audience, when you're getting an R of 0.7 and R squared of 0.5, you have got a strong relationship between low cardiovascular disease deaths and high cholesterol in that population. Now, anyone in the audience who may want to raise your hands, may not want to raise your hands, anyone in the audience on statins? I hope you're not, because we need our farmers to be fit and healthy and not suffering from muscle complaints. But a number of people who are on statins who see those charts rightly start to question why they're on statins. And one of the references that I put on this chart takes you to what is called the numbers needed to treat data. Now, if anyone had put their hands up, I would have said at the time that you were prescribed your statin by your GP, did your GP explain the numbers needed to treat data? Because they never do. And the number needed to treat data, which is independently assessed, 217 people need to be treated with a statin for 5 years for one person to avoid a non-fatal event. No lives are going to be saved. One person might avoid a non-fatal event in that same time period, because there is now a lawsuit going on in the US with statins and type 2 diabetes being strongly connected. Almost as many people, 1 in 204 will develop type 2 diabetes, and 1 in 20 will develop muscle damage that will lead to a pain level. So not only does that say we shouldn't be lowering cholesterol, when you go and look at the numbers on statins, they also confirm that's not a great idea. So we're on to part 3 now. How to win an argument with a vegetarian, which is a little bit disingenuous, because I hate to say it, you can't win an argument with a vegetarian. Because being vegetarian, and I know it, I was it for 20 years, it's a religion, it's a belief system. So I don't ever row on Twitter with vegans or vegetarians because there's just no point, because I know that it's a belief system. I know that the rational argument is not going to get through, just as it didn't get through to me until I realised that vitamins came in an animal form. And the second thing that ended my 20 years as a vegetarian was when I realised that to get 15 micrograms of vitamin D, I needed to eat either 200 grams of sardines or 39 eggs every single day. So vegans is not as good as vegetarian. Vegetarian is not as good as people who eat animals. So the nutritional argument, these are the three beliefs that vegetarians hold as to why they do what they do. The first is the nutritional argument. They claim that it is healthier. This is the easiest one to knock down because it just is impossible to argue. There are so many nutrients that are only found in animal foods. Retinol, as I've said, D3, K2, heme iron, the form of iron that the body actually wants. B12 is only found in animal products, so vegans have to take injections or a very strong supplement to get their B12, otherwise they'll get some pretty serious conditions. As I've said there, when I realised how many eggs I'd need to eat, vegans would have to eat 3.3 kilograms of sunshine-grown mushrooms, but they still wouldn't get D vitamin in the form that it's needed by the body. That would give them D2 rather than D3. And of course their big argument is you shouldn't eat animals because of the fat and cholesterol, and the evidence just isn't there. So they're not going to win on the nutritional argument. The second argument is the moral argument. We shouldn't kill. And vegetarian food has got a hell of a lot to answer for. We have gone from 100 million to 350,000 bison in the US, and only 12,000 of those are not actually crossbred with other animals. All of this, reference 11, is from the brilliant book by Leah Keith, a former vegan who is physically disabled now for life, will never bear children because of her years of being a vegan. So she has had an interest in researching this. Wolves have gone from 425,000 to barely 10,000. The North American prairies are 2% of their original size. And we are diverting so much water in certain parts of the world, particularly Asia. 80% of China's rivers will no longer support fish. This is before we get into the displacement of the animals, beautiful indigenous animals in the Amazon forests that are being chopped down to grow soy. Next point, I'll explain where we can have an agreement with the vegetarians on that soy. So their political argument is then we can only feed the world if everyone is vegetarian. Again, first of all, the vegetarian movement or being able to grow grains has a lot to answer for, because we would not be heading towards a population of 9 billion if we had not invented agriculture. When we were sustainable with the animals around us in communities, we had a natural population size. Our population is the size that it is today because we have developed the ability to manufacture carbohydrates in quite extraordinary quantities. And that vegetarian food is not sustainable. It is not giving back to the soil. By virtue of the fact that it has minerals in it, it is taken from the soil. Whereas the ruminants are so vital for our soil health. They give back to the land in a symbiosis of good health. They eat all those microorganisms in the soil. They host them. Their four stomachs digest all of that grass, take all of the goodness out, and then they regurgitate those microflora back onto the land. That is the future of soil. Alan Savory realized this. There's a great YouTube video where he talks about how wrong he was to talk about animals needing to move away from vegetation because they were eating it. He realized that as much as they were eating it, they were giving back to it. So where vegans and pasture-fed livestock people and the real food is, all should be able to have a heated agreement, is that the definition of human insanity is to grow food in a field to feed to a cow in a shed. When they quote the numbers to say we cannot feed the world if you're eating animal food, what they quote is how much water it takes to grow the soy, to chop down the Amazon rainforest, to then feed to poor cattle, mostly in American sheds, being pumped out for their far less ethical ways of managing the meat industry than we do in particularly the UK and Europe. And then to have those animals who can no more digest that soil, those grains, than arguably humans can. So vegans, we're with you. We do not want a single animal fed in a shed. We do not want an animal fed on the soy. We don't want food grown for animals in that way. But at the same time, you've then got to realise that when we stop that for animals, the soy that is going to be grown for you, vegetarians and vegans, because you don't want to eat those animals, is going to deplete the world of irrigation and of forests and divert rivers. So some questions that you can ask back. And it's better not to defend your position in an argument, but to lob a couple of grenades back, because it puts the other person on the back foot. And now you've got your little postcard. You can invite a vegetarian or a vegan to say, pick any plant food that you like, and I'll pick any animal food that I like. And if I were you, I'd pick liver. And let's have a nutritional argument. And how much do you want to lose? Sorry, how much do you want to wager on the bet that you might actually beat my animal food? Because you won't. And the moral argument, ask the vegan and the vegetarian, and it's a cruel question, and it's one that they don't want to address, and it's one that they want to be in denial over. What do you eat for which nothing has died? Do you seriously think when that grain field is ploughed with the combine harvesters, the size of which we have at the moment, that no rabbits died, and no birds died, and no voles, and no mice, and no worms, and no other flora? What about all the fish in those rivers that got irrigated to feed your plant food? What do you eat for which nothing has died? Because there isn't a single thing. And the political argument, how does your food replenish the topsoil, which at the end of the day, if we don't have that, we have nothing with which to feed the planet. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, and I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, I like to think, the next James Bond plot could be when the agri-food companies take over the planet because the soil has been destroyed because they love vegans, and we get to the point that you can grow everything upside down in a greenhouse with no soil involved. And of course we are seeing some of that at the moment with lettuce and strawberries and much upside down vegetation. But if we don't want that kind of Armageddon to come about, we have to protect our topsoil, and that means protecting our ruminants that are protecting that topsoil. So what should we eat? Real food. We shouldn't need to call it real food. It should be the fake food companies calling theirs fake food. 3 times a day maximum, I would recommend, because we have an obesity epidemic, we have diabetes epidemic. We used to eat no more than 3 times a day. We're now eating every 5 minutes. And we should choose that food for the nutrients it provides. And if we do that, we will naturally be drawn to certain foods. So there's a debate, should that be plants or animals? Michael Pollan, you may be familiar with this quote, famously said, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And my retort to that is eat food, mostly animals, quite a lot.